What I'd like to cover in this session is to give people some idea of what we've been working on in workflow since its initial release. So for those of you who don't know, we did a 1.0 release in November of last year. And since that time, we've been making a lot of different improvements in different areas. And I want to go over some of the little things, but also talk about some of the big areas where we've been developing new subsystems and talk about why we think those are important for you. So I hope most of you managed to make it to the keynote with Kosuke, and he talked about some of the ways that he thinks workflow is important in various parts of Jenkins. So sort of two main areas that he talked about were implementing continuous delivery. And he also talked about CD as code, or we can call it configuration as code. And that's really the idea that as much as possible of your build and test and deployment environment should be treated as code that you can revision, that you can test, that you can push out and have live. So that's less about making a change in the UI and kind of hoping for the best. And it's more about making a change in your source control system with documentation, with version comments that people can review, approve, track, roll back, merge, all of those things that you want to do. So I'll cover those kinds of themes in this talk. So first, just briefly for people who are not so familiar with what workflow does and why we created it. So there's sort of a crisis in Jenkins in terms of manageability of people's build pipelines that had special cases in them and that had a lot of custom steps and multiple stages and things like that. So the original way that freestyle projects were put together in Jenkins was really focused on continuous integration, and it really followed a strict model. You check out from source control, you do some build steps, you publish test results, you send mail, done. And there's not really any control over the particulars of that. As you can see in this screenshot, this is a real pipeline that was built with traditional Jenkins projects to do some tests and deployment of a particular application with a server backend and an Android UI. And in order to wire all of the bits of this together, you really had to do this kind of Rube Goldberg contraption of different things, starting other things at certain times. In order to see what was happening, you had to go to different configuration screens that were spread across different jobs. I don't even know which job it is that has this configuration screen. You'd have to sort of click on configure on each of them to figure out which it was. So it was hard to get a sense of what was going on overall and sort of make coordinated changes to this whole system. So we came up with this system called Workflow, which is a set of plugins that works in modern versions of Jenkins, and your entire process of doing builds and deployment and all of this can become one script. And this script basically is a way of, it's glue code, it's basically a way of telling Jenkins, okay, I'm running my regular build step now, but once this is done, use your plugin for publishing test results. Use your plugin for getting me a build machine on Amazon EC2. You know, take advantage of these different Jenkins features that are built at the points that you need them. So you can get slaves, you can check out sources using version control systems that are integrated with Jenkins. Most of the meat of what it does is going to be running external tools. And you can also wait for approval. This is something that people often need in these complex systems. You you need to do certain things, but then wait for a person to come in and say, yes, go ahead, everything looks good so far, you may proceed now. So workflow can just pause in the middle. It's like, people who started programming when I did, you learn to do things in BASIC, and there was just, you start it up, and then there was just a command that would ask for input from the user, and it would just pause there. And that was where the program was waiting for some more work from the user, and it was a very easy step to use. And workflow has a step called input that's basically that. It's basically basic. You're just waiting for the user to tell you to do something next. And one interesting piece is that the build, specifically the long-running external build tools, can survive a restart of Jenkins and disconnection of your slaves. So this is really important if your build pipeline is actually a 3-day process, and you need to restart Jenkins in the middle because it crashed, or you need to update some plugin, or whatever it is that required a restart. So since 1.0, we've done a bunch of monthly releases. We've had some little incremental improvements. One important one was being able to load the workflow script itself from version control. But I'll show what we're doing to make that more interesting. That one thing that came in recently, this second to last one, stash and retrieve files, is just a minor improvement, but I think it makes it more usable if you want to do builds that cross a number of different slaves. There's now an easy-to-use step that just lets you say, okay, take this build product they've created on one slave and just pop it over to another slave to do further processing. I want to send that as input to some functional tests, whatever you need. One of the things that we've been working on a lot is plugin compatibility. So unfortunately, the universe is not magic, and not every Jenkins plugin just works as soon as you install workflow. The reason is usually that these plugins were written to expect a very linear model with traditional jobs. So the version control plugins are expecting that there's only one version control system in use by your job. It always does the checkout before you do any other build steps. So in order to make all of these plugins work with workflow, it requires some changes. We've been doing a bunch of these changes. When we launched, we had version control support for Get, Mercurial, and Subversion. People who maintain CVS, Perforce, Rational Team Concert plugins have lately been adding support for workflow to those. The second line, Garrett, and so on, these are ways of starting your job under certain conditions. Probably the most frequently requested one is the GitHub push trigger. And I haven't checked my email this morning, but I expect that to be merged any day now. So we'll be able to use that. Just a couple days ago, we got support for analysis publishers. This means publishing results from Find Bugs, Check Style, Task Scanner, PMD, which is another style checker, and several others in this genre. So all of those are now ready to be used by workflow. And some others. We still have various other plugins we know about that could really stand an integration. Some plugin, in some cases, it's more a question of convenience. So some plugins basically just offered a way to run a build step that you could use, that you could just call like it was a shell script or anything like that. So running Maven or some other tool like that. But we'd like to have some nicer integrations for those. And I recently did an office hour, which I think Kosuke mentioned in the keynote. So that's a way for plugin developers to get on board with the kinds of updates that they need to make for this. So there were a set of features that were tied to the current long-term support release of Jenkins. This is the 1.609.1.2.3 line. So if you are running the latest long-term support line, or if you're running a weekly release after this, then you can use these features. You just have to update to the newest workflow releases that match. One important one was support for build wrappers. So there's there's a lot of things that fall into this category, but basically they're all Jenkins plugins that do some kind of setup when you start them. And then typically they set some environment variables. Sometimes they modify build output by adding colorization or hyperlinks, that sort of thing. And then they typically do some kind of cleanup at the end. And these are all now available within workflow so that you can write just a block in your code that does things like starts up an XVNC server. So if anyone who's familiar with Unix tries to do server-side testing of things with any kind of UI, so whether that be Selenium browser testing or native applications with graphical interfaces, it's very painful to get an environment set up where you can have a mock display for the duration of your tests. So you can now use the XVNC or equivalently the X virtual frame buffer plugins can both be used with workflow to sort of cordon off a section of your build that has to run with a virtual display enabled. There's a bunch of other things. Config files plugin is a very useful way of having sort of secret settings files that you drop into a build temporarily and so on. There's also support for pulling in credentials from Jenkins credentials store and using those in a workflow. And one very frequently requested integration was added recently with the SSH agent. So if anyone who ever does SSH or SCP to log into a remote server or copy files to a remote server with SSH protocol, this allows you to pick up SSH credentials from Jenkins where they're stored securely in Jenkins side, not in your project, and use those for the duration of one command or a set of commands within your workflow. Some other sort of more technical changes, but also important in 1609, had to do with the display of the build widget. So this now works more properly. So if a workflow is paused for input, you may have done 3 hours of building and testing, and then it pops up a prompt that says, hey, let me know, this is on a staging server, let me know when you think this is ready to go to production. That might happen on a Friday afternoon. It might be days before someone actually comes back and clicks OK. While it's in that pause state, it's not consuming any resources. So it's not like a freestyle project where you'd have to have a slave actually live and running a sleep command or something like that. Jenkins is just waiting for you to click OK, and it's not doing anything else. And there's also some changes to make it easier to restart in the middle of a flow. And so Docker integration was one of the major areas that we worked on. I actually gave this talk in DC a few months ago, in which I presented sort of the full glory of the Docker integration. So there's a plugin called Docker Workflow plugin, and it has a bunch of features that make it possible to run build steps inside Docker containers and create new Docker images and run those Docker images in fresh containers for testing and so on. And so the full demo shows actually 2 different containers running simultaneously, one with an application you just built, another with another test environment that's running some custom Selenium tests, and it's wiring them together so that you can run Selenium-based acceptance tests of your application from an isolated environment and so on. One of the feedback I got from that talk was that a lot of people said, well, I don't care about Docker. I'm not using Docker. Why should I pay attention to this? What I'd like to say to that is, well, you do need to pay attention to Docker, even if you're not deploying anything to Docker. So even if the end result is a Visual C++ application that runs on Windows 95, it doesn't matter. If you are able to use Docker containers to set up a build environment, this is a much easier way to manage Jenkins because, and this ties into the CD as code aspect. Instead of having a bunch of slaves pre-connected to Jenkins that some administrator has gone and manually installed some packages on, and you call them up in the middle of the night and say, hey, I want to, tweak things a little bit so that, I need an extra library installed on this so I can build this new version of my application and so on. You don't need to do that anymore. So using Docker Workflow plugin, your build, your Jenkins workflow definition, which can be part of your project now, says what Docker image should be used to run build steps. The slave can be any kind of big hardware sitting in a dark server room somewhere. No customizations to the slave, and no customizations really to Jenkins itself other than, yeah, it can run Docker on slaves. All of the details, the specifics of what kinds of stuff you might want to run in your build live in your source code repository, and you version them along with your source code. It's a much more attractive way of working. So that's why I say this is sort of the critical use case for Jenkins of Docker. It's not so much deploying Docker images. If you do that, great, and we can help with that. But for everyone else, this makes it a lot easier to manage Jenkins more sensibly. Another change that we just got in a few weeks ago with Kosuke's help is ability to have custom DSLs. So we already had a system for letting you define class libraries that could be used by any workflow that was running on your Jenkins installation. So it was very much like the equivalent of sort of dropping a library jar into your class path or something like that. But the result still very much looked like you were using some programming library. And we really wanted to have something that was lighter weight for the author of the individual workflow. So you're sort of shifting some of the burden of knowing about workflow and what it does, and knowing about Jenkins, really shifting some of that burden towards a Jenkins admin or some engineer on the team who has more Jenkins experience can set up some of these libraries, and then everyone else can kind of use them without knowing too much about the details. So the way we do this is that there's now a way of defining global variables. We did this for the Docker Workflow plugin. It defines a new variable called Docker, and that sort of serves as your entry point for all of the different things that you can do related to Docker. Now you can build your own. So you can create, all you have to do is drop a new file named something.groovy into a certain location in Jenkins, and it defines a new global variable, and you can use it as a starting point for a domain-specific language. So a particular customized workflow language for your site that makes sense for your kinds of applications. And with the Groovy language, a function and a variable are pretty much the same. A function is just something with a call method. So all you have to do, if you define a method with the special name call, then you've just defined something that looks like a new function, and that means that it looks like a new workflow step. So if there's a missing workflow step that you want to use, you don't want to write a plugin just for this purpose, and it's basically just a convenience around other lower level workflow steps. You can just define one file that has a call method in it, and basically you've created a new step, potentially in a few minutes. And one neat thing you can also do with Groovy is it has something called a builder pattern that uses some language tricks I won't go into. The end result is that you create something that looks more like a configuration file than like a program. So this last line here is syntactically valid workflow script if there were a library that were actually using it. And as you can see, it's stating what kind of job you want, And then you can give some attributes, one per line, name equal value. So it's not the same thing as YAML syntax or things like this, but it looks pretty similar. Now, the other main thing that I've been spending a lot of time on is what we call support for multiple branches, multi-branch. So here is a real screenshot on the left. If you can see this, I'm sorry, if you're in the back, you probably can't. What we have here is actually a build of Jenkins core on a Jenkins server. And builds number 3064, 65, and 66 were respectively successful, test failures, and successful again. Those were all builds of the master branch, so the main line of Jenkins development. And then somebody filed a pull request on GitHub, number 1772, and whatever they did, it was obviously very wrong because the build didn't even have test failures, it just broke, it didn't even compile. And so this Jenkins job that builds all of these turned red because the newest build was build number 3068 that built this pull request and it was broken. That pull request is bad. And so it looks, and so if you're just glancing at this casually, it looks like the build is broken when really it's just one bad pull request. And then somebody filed another pull request, one 1814, and they had some test failures that they fixed, and then someone else filed another pull request, 1815, and it looks like it was fine for a while, and then they broke it. And so now at this point, it looks like Jenkins is broken again. This doesn't make any sense, right? This is mixing up totally different things. The main line of development that's accepted with different changes that different developers are doing. So there are two workarounds. So, and this is using the first trick in Jenkins, which is you can set wildcards on branches. So you can have it build different branches as part of the same job. But that gets you into this sort of nightmarish build history here. And the other thing you can do is you can create one project per branch so that you don't have to deal with that. So you have a clean build history in each branch. But then, well, how do you maintain all of those? Do you have to copy configuration snippets from one project to another? That doesn't seem, that's not viable when you have dozens of branches coming in. And this is a really common problem. Everybody asks about this. So there's a system that's been around for Jenkins for a couple years, but hasn't been sort of pushed the last mile, which is called Multibranch, which solves this basic problem. It automatically creates a subproject for every branch that you have in your version control system. And each subproject is a full-fledged build, and it has its own build history that you can see independently of all the others. We've recently integrated this with Jenkins, with workflow, and we call this multi-branch workflow. And the idea here is that if you put a special file into your branch and you call it Jenkinsfile, this is a workflow script. And if Jenkins sees that, then it builds it as a workflow, and it runs that script. And from within your workflow, you probably want the rest of your sources that are in the same repository. To get them, you just say check out SCM. You don't give details of the location of source control or credentials or any of that stuff there. You just say, yeah, check out the rest of the source code next to Jenkinsfile once you have a slave and a workspace ready. And this is already available for Git. So that means they can look for branches in a Git repository and automatically build them. The same works for Subversion. So Subversion has a little bit of a different notion of branches, but it's basically paths in the Subversion server that you can specify, and it tries to build each path as its own project. And Mercurial is very similar to Git here, and that's supported. So those are already available. What we have under development, which we hope to release soon, is specialized support for GitHub. So that if you are using GitHub, and that includes GitHub Enterprise and private repositories and all of that. They can find branches in GitHub using the GitHub REST API, so it's a little bit faster way of getting information from GitHub. And that should also be integrated with the webhook so that as soon as something happens on GitHub's side, GitHub sends Jenkins a notification and Jenkins immediately reacts. So if you push a new branch to your repository because you're starting a new feature, Jenkins immediately knows about it, immediately automatically creates a subproject for it, starts building it. If you merge a branch and you close it, Jenkins will notice that, and if you've configured it to do so, it will clean up the old subproject that you're no longer interested in the build history, or you can keep it around for a week or something like this. A couple other things are also under development that are currently slated to be part of CloudBees Jenkins platform. So for CloudBees customers, you'd also get support for GitHub pull requests. So that would mean that if somebody forks your repository and issues a pull request against it, then we immediately notice that fork exists and start building from that fork as well. So you can do pull request-driven development, and depending on the status of the Jenkins build, then it will update the status in GitHub. So GitHub will say, checking your changes with Jenkins, and then if the build is good, it'll say, yep, thumbs up from Jenkins. And there are some other kinds of services similar to GitHub, like Stash, that we would like to offer integrations for as well, along the same lines. And one little interesting thing, it seems like it's a technical detail, but it really matters, is that the version of Jenkinsfile, the workflow that it runs, is always guaranteed to be the exact same version that you got when you did the checkout SCM command. And that means that you can make changes to your workflow script that parallel changes you make to your real project. So as soon as you change your Ant script to start running JUnit tests, in the same commit, you can make changes to your workflow script to publish the JUnit tests. And unlike a freestyle, with a freestyle project, if you are changing the job configuration, you're going into the UI and you're clicking some checkboxes and selecting some pull downs and making some changes. And you hope that those changes work. So you've asked to publish test results from the right location or the right kind of test results or something like that. If you get it wrong, you're on the hook for rolling back to the previous configuration because you've just broken everybody else's build. Right? So even though you were just trying to add new JUnit tests. You haven't added them yet because they're not being published yet. So you go and try to select the publisher for them, but the publisher fails because there are no test results or something. So you go and push your changes that create the test results, and then you go and edit the project to try to publish the test results, and then that breaks somebody else's build that doesn't have test results yet. It just becomes a mess. With a Jenkins file in a branch, you can just file a pull request that has both changes. Create the tests and publish to Jenkins. That's part of your pull request. Maybe that pull request is good and it works. Everything will come up as blue balls, and you go ahead and merge. If there's any problem, you can fix it on your own time. You can fix it the next day. The master branch is not affected at all. So that's a really, really important change. And going a little bit further, people also had the problem that not only did they have dozens of branches in one repository that they're struggling to build, but in certain cases, people had a lot of repositories. And sometimes all of these basically followed the same model. So they're all building the same kind of application in the same way, but from different source bases. Maybe you're using microservices and you're using a standard framework for building and deploying and testing your microservices in a particular language and so on. But you want to keep them in a dozen different source code repositories. And you don't want to have to go into Jenkins and set up a fresh job every time you want to add a new microservice. You just want to say, here, Jenkins, here's new stuff, go and take it. So we're creating a new plugin whose name is still to be determined, but I'll just call it organization scanning for now. So the idea is that you would go and select, say, a GitHub organization that you own, and the only things that you put into the Jenkins configuration are name of GitHub organization, GitHub access token. So you go to GitHub and say, I want a new access token for Jenkins to use, and you copy it, paste in that token, and then you click go. After that point, Jenkins uses GitHub APIs. It finds all of the repositories in that organization that have Jenkinsfile in it. It automatically sets up projects for all of those in a kind of a folder that has all of these projects in it. And each of these projects is in turn a multi-branch project, so it automatically knows how to deal with different branches and pull requests and everything inside that project. If you add new projects, you just take your organization standard code template for build script, Jenkinsfile, and hello world source code. That just all goes into a new repository. You create repository on GitHub. The webhook kicks in, and Jenkins knows about the new project, starts building, and a few seconds later, you get feedback. You're ready to go. So that this really takes away a lot of the going into Jenkins to configure something. You're not going into Jenkins to configure jobs. The jobs just appear based on the definitions here. So that makes it a lot easier to sort of manage systems with a lot of different repos. So we expect to release an implementation of this for GitHub. Again, this would handle private repositories and GitHub Enterprise if you're using that. And CloudBees customers, we try to provide with similar integrations for other systems that provide sets of repositories managed under one server. So I think this is a really interesting way to get you one step closer to a world where all of your configuration work happens in your own version control systems, and Jenkins is a service that's running builds of these things and telling you about the results, but it's not something you're managing on a day-to-day basis by itself. It's mostly just a place that stores an attachment to build servers and some global credentials. I unfortunately wasn't able to do a live demo here today because of the setup, but here's an example of what Jenkinsfile might look like if you have one of these environments with a standardized project template. So here a Jenkins administrator, someone who's familiar with the details of workflow, has created something called vars standard build.groovy. I'm sorry, it didn't paste into this slide. Trust me, that's about a dozen lines of code. And this Jenkinsfile, this is what would actually go into a particular repository that you have here. So here, someone is playing around with the Go language. It's a popular new language from Google, and they want to see what it takes to create a little Hello World Go project. So if you go into Google search and you say Hello World Go program, you actually get this hello world.go here. And they want to see what they need to do to build it. So what do? Well, first of all, you need a build environment. Or are you going to go and tell your Jenkins administrator that for your little weekend project, they have to go and install the Go development environment, SDK, whatever they call it? Well, no, you don't need to do that. If you go to search for Golang Docker and click on the first hit, you will come to the Docker Hub image page for Golang, which you see here, which is an environment that's expressly designed to build and run Go programs. The latest release of it happens to be version 1.5.0, so fine, let's try that. So you say environment is Golang 150. That's the build environment I want to use for my main script. And in my main script here, I found somewhere in the internet that you have to say go build and then a file name. And it turns out that works. So the Go executable is somewhere in the path inside this Docker container. I didn't set that up. That just comes standard off of Docker Hub. And the result is an executable file in my slave workspace called Hello World. And so they have a postscript that runs after the Docker container is exited that just tries running the new executable, and indeed it prints Hello World. So that's great. And then what if I want to, so if I want to rename my file name, I don't want to use hello-world.go. I want to make it a slightly different file name. I just go, I have a clone of my repository. I edit this Jenkins file and change where it says hello-world.go to a different file name. I rename the file. I commit the result. I file a pull request. Done. It works. So when a new project gets created for that pull request, it shows the new version of Jenkinsfile building my new version of project sources, and it works. I want to see if I can make something compatible with an older Go runtime or older Go libraries. I just go and edit the Jenkins file and replace 150 with 142, which I also find on Docker Hub. File a pull request. Indeed, it builds. That's all you have to do. At no point did I need to go and change my Jenkins slave configuration or anything like that. I just edited my sources, committed, pushed, and everything is set up to run in a new build environment. So I think this is why I say Docker is a very developer-friendly way of doing builds. It really makes a lot of these things much easier. And if you want to set up a custom build environment that's not something on Docker Hub, the Docker workflow plugin includes a pretty simple syntax for picking up a Docker file from your workspace. So a Docker file would say something like from Ubuntu or from Golang, that's my base environment, run, and then some shell command to install some additional libraries as root. And you can set up a standard global library that lets the developer just check in a Docker file next to the Jenkins file next to their source code. And the Docker file gives the exact build environment needed for that particular project. And if they want to customize the libraries included in that project, you just edit the Docker file, start using those libraries in your source code, commit, pull request, and you're all set. Again, no interaction with, you never even have to go to the Jenkins web UI to see that, much less get help from a Jenkins admin. So I have a few minutes. I just wanted to highlight a few things that we're looking at for the future. People always ask about how do I have syntax completion for IDEs if I want to write my workflows in IntelliJ, Eclipse, NetBeans. So we'd like to provide some syntax completion tools for popular IDEs and static reference guide for all of the steps that are available, especially as more plugins come online that have special integration with workflow, first-class integration. They add new syntax elements. We want to be able to just have a generated document with all of these things. We want to do some kind of replacement for matrix projects where you have a bunch of different, say, platforms or tool versions that you're building, maybe one by one, maybe all in parallel, and possibly on a bunch of different slaves, all as part of one build process. And then you want to take all of those results and publish them in a matrix of, which version of Java, which version of, which platform, Windows versus Linux. You want to be able to provide a nice grid that shows the status of all of your tests on all of those different combinations. So that's something we'd like to do. And then a bunch of miscellaneous things. People would like to be able to get mail that hyperlinks back to a particular spot in their workflow where things failed. Kosuke is actually playing with a pause button for a workflow, so you can be going along in the middle of some multi-day process and say, hold on, pause, and then see what's going on, or maybe try to adjust the environment before you resume it. And then there's all sorts of other little fixes and minor changes that we'd like to do. There's over 200 things that are filed, so obviously we have to triage and pick the things that are most important to work on. The good news is that we recently hired several new people at CloudBees who are working in large part on workflow-related topics. So once they get some more experience, they should be able to contribute a lot of new features and bug fixes more rapidly. So that's it. We still have some time for questions. Also, whatever time is not left over, please come by the expert booth. Thank you.